Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Achates Live on Tuesday, the 15th of September for our session COVID 6 months on. This is the first session in our new season. So welcome back, everyone. It's lovely to see so many old friends, familiar faces and some new faces over on the YouTube chat this afternoon. I am Kerry-Ann Isles, Executive Director of Achates Philanthropy and your host for today's session. I'm a cis, straight white female.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Welcome. With blonde curly hair. Excuse me if you got a little feedback there. I forgot to mute my YouTube stream. Classic mistake. These sessions are brought to you by Achates Philanthropy. We are a creative consultancy with a holistic approach to fundraising. We take our name from Greek and Roman mythology. Achates was the close friend and loyal advisor to Aeneas. We think our name neatly describes the relationship we offer to the cultural sector. We set up Achates Live to support the sector, bringing fundraisers together to discuss key topics and also to enable you to help each other. Achates doesn't have all the answers, but we do have an overview of the cultural sector and we'd like to use this role in a supportive way. Our live stream started as a series of workshops in conjunction with the Old Vic in London. COVID-19 closures means that we've moved the series online as we felt it was really important to continue our support of the sector through the challenges that the crisis has presented for all of us. Today's session, COVID 6 months on, is looking at what we've all learned over the last 6 months and how the sector has adapted to the new challenges we have all faced and are still facing. I'm going to hand you over now to Caroline, who will introduce the session for you in a bit more detail. Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks, Kerry, and as you say, it's a real pleasure to be back with everyone. Am I okay, Kerry? You're indicating to me there's a problem, but am I okay? I'll keep going. Somebody will tell me if there's a problem. It's a pleasure to be back with you all. As Kerry-Ann has already introduced herself, I'll say that I'm also a cis white female, also with curly hair, but a little bit longer than Kerry-Ann's. I'm also really delighted that today I'm welcoming 3 very special guests to our session, and they are 3 members of Achates' team. Really brilliant people who I have the pleasure to work with and share the expertise of every day, and I'm really grateful that they're going to share that with you today as well. So Kerry-Ann herself is going to be one of our panellists, Kane Moore, our Director of Development, and also Natasha Bloor. First time on Achates Live, Tash, great to have you on here, and Tash is our Head of Trusts. So really great to be able to share the expertise of our brilliant team with you today. And of course, as Kerry-Ann said, we're very lucky in that we have quite an overview of the sector. So we thought it was a good moment to zoom in and share that with you. But a little context before we jump in. I've been working in the cultural sector now for more than 25 years, and it's always been a case that fundraising and strategy have been at the heart of the work I do. In that period, it's been really clear that trends have both developed and accelerated, which have led us to the situation that we had prior to COVID. And that was a situation where the capital, London, really dominated the cultural scene, although a number of cities such as Manchester and Leeds are really working strategically together to redress the balance there. The big cultural brands are not only the most heavily state funded, but they also receive most of the voluntary income. And as we know, a statistic I quote quite a lot, 60% of the voluntary income goes to the 50 biggest brands. And it's really challenging to find true major donors or major scale sponsors outside of this group. Yet, many of these organisations have in recent years been moving to a quasi-commercial role with an increasing focus on commercial income generation and a more limited role perhaps in supporting the sector as a whole. That's not universally true, but it has been a trend that's been developing. So touring activities perhaps reduced and wide-ranging intrinsic and instrumental value also readdressed there. The regional distribution of cultural organisations has been patchy, and I think it's fair to say that the balance of MPO payments to organisations is really a series of historical incidents that of course has evolved over time. And there's also been something of an expectation that once an organisation is in the portfolio, it will remain there ad infinitum. And that's meant it's become increasingly challenging for young companies to break through and change the narrative. And as a result, the focus on the democratization of institutions has been on individuals who try to change the culture and work of existing organisations with varying degrees of success. In short, it's been a sector that perhaps has been in need of a shake-up. COVID has been more than a shake-up. It's accelerated many of the trends we already knew were coming. And one of the really shocking aspects of it is that it has placed many of those same major institutions I referred to a moment ago, who seemed invulnerable to risk and sort of floating off into a more commercial future. As much as small organisations, they have been shook at a time when we really need a sound ecosystem in which the apex organisations really support and nurture smaller organisations. In short, it's a really dangerous time, and we are all seriously concerned about the cultural landscape we're going to be left with at the end of this period. As we return from what I hope for some of you has been something of a summer break, after an exhausting first part of the year in which almost everything we thought we knew has changed, we thought that it would be a really useful moment to pause, take breath, and reflect on what we've learned so far. I hope that you'll be able to take from this session something of a context in terms of organisations, audiences, and voluntary income generation to help inform the key process of strategisation, which I know many of the conversations that I have with you are focused on right now and is at the forefront of everyone's mind. And as a result, we have a special focus on that next month, but this month, we're going to really think about the context that we're in at the present time. So I'm going to turn to our three brilliant panelists and ask each of them to reflect on a different aspect of the sector. I think, Kane, you're going to start by commenting on organisations. And then I think Kerrian is going to talk about audiences. And then finally, Tash is going to sum it up in terms of the impact and the result for funders. So, and then I'll go into some questions, and then there'll be time for questions for all of you as well. So, Kane, if I can hand over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Caroline. My name's Kane, and I am Director of Development of Achates Philanthropy. I am a cisgendered white male with sort of brownish hair that used to be blonde, starting to get a few grey hairs, and I need a shave at the moment, basically. In reflecting on the response of cultural sector organisations to COVID-19, I wanted to briefly touch on four key themes: resilience, diversity, digital, and focus. COVID-19 has fundamentally turned on its head what it means to be a resilient arts organisation. As touched on by Caroline just now, over the past decade, as the state subsidy has declined, organisations have been encouraged to diversify and build their earned and private income, to look at how they can generate greater commercial and earned income across their activity, and how they can sweat their assets through avenues like private hires or training or consultancy services. The National Campaign for the Arts Index report found that earned income has increased by 47% over the last decade. And last year's Private Investment in Culture survey shows that earned income prior to COVID-19 made up just over half of organisations' income mix, with the largest growth being amongst major brands with a turnover of over £5 million. This earned income base has in effect collapsed since COVID-19. Whilst venues have started to reopen, it's only at a fraction of their capacity. And it is difficult to see this income base recovering in the medium to long term and until a vaccine has been rolled out. And whilst it has been larger organisations, and in particular those with state subsidy, that have been left those without state subsidy, that have been left most exposed, we can also see the trickle-down impact on smaller organisations, including touring companies, as venues' cultural programmes collapse. Emergency support through avenues like DCMS has certainly helped to prop up the sector, but I would argue has made it incredibly difficult to plan for the long term, when little is known about what future support may be coming down the line, and when venues are left vulnerable and exposed to future social distancing with little to no contingencies in place. In consequence, we're starting to see really profound redundancies. And what is really worrying is the impact that this contraction in the sector will have on the diversity of the arts, particularly when it is those with protected characteristics who are most likely to hold entry-level or freelance positions, roles that are most clearly under threat. Now, online activity has played a vital role in organisations sustaining a programme to engage their audiences, beneficiaries and supporters over the closure period. The adoption of digital technology has been really, really rapid. And we've seen two overlapping strategies emerge. The first has been the rollout of digital content, performances, tours, talks, commissions, virtual exhibitions. Most of this has been free, though there has been some testing of paid for events, like with the Old Vic, and the integration of really strong donation messaging. This activity has helped organisations reach international audiences and often welcome many, many more audiences than would ever visit their venue in person. Little Angel, for example, now have over 10,000 subscribers to their YouTube channel and engage audiences in the thousands to each of their online shows and creative workshops, despite being a really small 100-seater venue. But does such online program represent a viable income base going forward? Can and should online activity sit behind paywalls, and to what extent does this reinforce disabling barriers to access? The second digital strand has been the pivot of organisations' engagement activity to remote delivery, and there have been some real exemplars across the sector of how organisations have continued to support and provide a lifeline to the most vulnerable young people and communities during this time. And whilst much of this activity has taken place online, we have also seen organisations really pivot their focus towards direct emergency response. In previous sessions, we've heard from Farnham Mortons working with the council to run a helpline service for vulnerable residents, and Tourette's Hero, who've been running a food and essential service and support programme for disabled and neurodiverse Londoners and their families. I would argue that it is those organisations that, against the backdrop of an increasing focus on funders on helping those most impacted by COVID-19, and that have been able to demonstrate and communicate the social impact and the vital role of the arts within society, that have shown themselves to be most resilient over this period, able to, for example, access emergency grants and funding. Okay, that's my short introduction done. I am now going to pass over to Kerrian, who's going to talk about audiences. Kerrian.
Apologies for the slight delay there, people. I was just engaging on the chat. Kirsty was just saying goodbye and I was just giving her a little wave off. She said, thank you very much for all the support over the last 6 months. So that was really nice to hear. Just a little one to share before I jump into my piece. So as Kane said, I am focusing on audiences. We've spoken in previous sessions about how those organisations that have a clear idea of their audiences, their needs and wants, and how to create responsive projects to meet those needs are the organisations that have been able to maintain engagement, serving audiences and successfully fundraising from emergency funding sources. But how have audiences responded to the work that organisations and artists have delivered digitally? And what have we learned from audience behaviour over the last 6 months? This is something that Kane's touched on already in what he was talking about. Obviously, I think we can't completely separate organisations from audiences, but I think it's really useful to look at these things in a little bit of isolation so we can see what the trends have been over the last few months. In previous sessions, we focused quite heavily on how organisations have adapted their work to serve audiences during lockdown. So I'm not going to focus on that today. Instead, I'm looking at the data that's been gathered and shared over the past 6 months and what we've learned from that. I've looked particularly at 2 key reports, one from Indigo, which was particularly around the performing arts, and one from Alva, which was around museums and visitor attractions. So the data from the Wave 1 report from both of those sources from April and May 2020 showed some significantly different behaviour was planned by audiences. So those early surveys were really looking at responses to closure, how audiences felt about how things would develop over the, at that point over the next few months. At that point, the Indigo survey reported that 74% of people really wanted to get back to live events, and 55% said they wanted to support their local venue. I think this really reflects the early positivity and the willingness to act as communities to provide support that we saw in those early stages of lockdown. However, at the time, only 17% were booking live events, and most of those were being booked for November or later, which I think is completely understandable given the messaging we had at the time, and also probably quite wise given where we are at the moment, knowing that we're in September already, and the world is actually, for a lot of people, still looking fairly uncertain. At that time, at 79%, they would be willing to give a donation at point of sale when venues reopen to assist recovery. And this is going to tie in with something that I know Tash is going to be talking about later, so I'm not going to go into that too much right now. The ALVA report from the same period reflected that 41% of respondents would be happy to return to visitor attractions in 3 to 6 months. So from that point, that would take us to kind of July, October, which is slightly different, obviously, to what we're seeing with the theatre and performing arts venues. It was suggested that that would partly be around the expectation that many respondents weren't planning to go abroad over the summer, but they might visit UK attractions instead, with country parks and nature reserves and gardens being included in that list. So you can see that's quite a different offer from those type of organisations than from performing arts, indoor-based venues where the threat from COVID seems quite different. ALVA didn't specify how many people would give at point of sale or during a visit, but they did reflect that reopening was expected to be a good time for asks to be made. And interestingly, the group they reflected as largest amongst the likely groups to give were young people and families, which I thought was really interesting and is something that I know we're going to revisit slightly later. From wave 2, so this is where the structure of these reports differs slightly. So Indigo produced 2 reports, wave 1 and wave 2. ALVA produced 4, so waves 1, 2, 3 and 4. So what I've taken for the second set of data is Indigo wave 2 and ALVA wave 4, which were the most recent reports, both from July. And at that point, quite a different picture emerged, actually, interestingly. So 69% of people who responded to the Indigo survey said they would not consider booking a live event for at least 3 months. And we saw that really reflected in the decisions of a lot of venues deciding to stay closed until the new year. So we know that from March, a lot of people were thinking they would be reopening September, October, but we know now that a lot of, particularly the larger venues, are looking at reopening from January 21. At that point, also 84% said they were interested in engaging with culture digitally and online. But worryingly, picking up on what Kane was saying earlier, only half would say they would pay for it, which is something I've certainly seen played out with some of the clients I work with who have been exploring ideas around paid for content and asks particularly connected to content, and are finding that that can be quite challenging. There has also been a lot of free digital content. I think Kane referred to the Little Angel content. I know that we engaged with some of that and it was wonderful. So what's this going to do for the value of the arts in the longer term? 94% said they were interested in culture outdoors, but again, only 3/4 said they would be willing to pay for it. I find that trend slightly troubling, I have to say, for a number of reasons, but I'm sure we can pick up on that later. In line with that, 81% said that they were worried about the future of cultural organisations, which I think if we're looking at the amount of people that are willing to pay for outdoor or digital content, yeah, I think that makes sense. The audience agency's Bouncing Forward survey was encouraging in terms of digital engagement, with 62% of respondents discovering new forms of art and culture during the period, and 64% viewing more arts and cultural content online. The audience agency doesn't actually reflect any information about whether audiences will pay for content or if they would see free content as a motivation to give, which I thought was quite interesting, that that was a kind of a big chunk of information that they weren't particularly looking at in their work. The Wave 4 ALVA reports showed that 49% would return to attractions by July 2020. Though with some visitors feeling slightly less confident about visiting museums and galleries. That was down 7% from the previous report. But I do wonder if this is reflective of the nervousness that a lot of us felt when lockdown was first eased, and the lack of clarity that we had in the guidelines that seemed to lead to a lack of confidence in what we could and couldn't do. I know I certainly did, and I'm sure some of you had conversations with friends and family where you were trying to figure out what was acceptable and what wasn't in terms of meeting, socialising and going out to visit attractions and events. Interestingly, the ALVA report doesn't reflect how additional giving might be viewed by visitors as a way to aid recovery, though I think this is likely to be reflective of the different funding models we see for some of the major visitor attractions that are included in their findings. I think if you were able to separate that data out and look at just museums and galleries, there may be some slightly different data to reflect there. I think there's a key opportunity here for us as a sector that I think so many are missing at the moment. We need to think more carefully about how we demonstrate our value and how we're asking for support, particularly at a time when there's a continued and highly compelling need for frontline services to be supported. How do we make the case for culture? And do we, as a sector, need to get better at describing what we do, refining our case for support, and particularly thinking about how we're targeting those different demographics? If we're looking at a change in those main giving groups to, you know, shifting away from those traditional donor bases to younger people, families, how can we use that as a vehicle? And this is a moment to start democratizing philanthropy and giving new messages about what philanthropy can mean now, and moving away from those transactionally based giving schemes that are so traditional across the arts sector. I think we can really refine and clarify why we're needed and what we bring to society that so many people have missed over the last 6 months. And I hope on that note, this will be a really good point to hand over to the fantastic Tash Blore, who is our trust manager. She is going to talk a little bit about the funding landscape and the changes that we've seen there. Thanks, Tash.
Thanks, Kerry-Ann. So yes, I'm Tash. I'm the trust manager at Achates, as Kerry-Ann said, and I'm white, I'm a cis woman, and I have long, dark, wavy hair that is probably a bit too long. And this is actually my first live, so that's exciting. I'll be running through what we've learned about funders over the last 6 months and how we can use that learning. And I think that we should be starting with trust and statutory. So at the outset of the crisis, we saw trusts responding nimbly, launching new flexible grant programs and emergency funding initiatives with quick turnaround times, as well as offering existing grantees the freedom of unrestricted funding. This was primarily focused around support for organisations doing frontline work with vulnerable groups, with limited emergency funding for arts and culture. Statutory funders like ACE and the National Lottery also launched a first wave of emergency funds. However, beyond emergency funding, multiple grant makers paused all new applications for an extended period that is still for many continuing. Many have yet to reopen, with ongoing review of their funding priorities taking place. We anticipate that on reopening, the trusts will be prioritising community-focused work with a really clear social impact designed to respond to the widening inequalities that have been produced by COVID. Alongside this, following ongoing global anti-racism protests, trusts are also likely to increase their commitment to tackling systemic racism, as well as scrutinising the diversity of organisations that apply to them. Some may also continue in the vein of emergency funding for existing grantees and pivot to ongoing core funding longer term, with a need for organisations to revise their budget plans accordingly. From a statutory perspective, there's a lack of certainty about whether there will be any ACE strategic funds in the short term. We know that ACE has dipped heavily into their reserves, although I think they have managed to retain some small cushion for the future. Lottery funds have been in decline for a while, in line with decreasing lottery revenues. The demands on these limited statutory sources will also be considerable at a time when local and regional government funds are under mounting pressure. Capital projects also now face significantly reduced trust prospects, with a limited desire to fund all but the most time-sensitive building work. As of September, we've just done a review of 30 of England's main arts capital funders, and that suggests that 50% of them are currently closed, with uncertainty around when they'll reopen. In this context of reduced and refocused trust funding, it will be absolutely crucial, as Kerry-Ann said, that organisations are demonstrating the value, both intrinsic and instrumental, of their work. There is a need to focus clearly on articulating audience-informed responses, as well as the social impacts and outcomes they bring about. To do this, organisations will need a laser-sharp focus on their own vision, their mission, and an in-depth understanding of who they serve and how they do that now. This is really the time to drill down and build strong theories of change and logic models to support that. As a sector, we must also get stronger, as Kerry-Ann said, at making the case for the indispensable role we play within our society. There's been no greater demonstration of this than during lockdown, where we've all glimpsed a world without the arts. Moving forward, we must communicate the ways in which we're an integral part of social life. And then we must back it up with data. Okay, so now thinking about individuals, which in contrast to trusts have seen a significant increase over the last 6 months. Audiences have responded positively to calls for support from artists and venues. Spectrix have reported a 95% annual increase in individual donations in March to April 2020 over last year, and a 71% increase in orders which contain a donation. This seems to signal a shift away from transactional to philanthropic engagement that's going to be important to note, and can be considered alongside the ALBA data Kerry-Ann shared about young people and families being the most likely groups to give to cultural organisations as they reopen. And with current limited scope for donor engagement around events, shows, exhibitions, any gathering of people, there is a clear need to build relationships with donors that are more explicitly framed around social impact. New narratives are needed, and as I touched on with trusts, these need to clearly articulate the value that organisations create within their communities. In this, I also think it's worth taking stock of the way the crisis has prompted a real surge in volunteering, donations, and mutual aid initiatives across all parts of society. This feels like an important overarching trend for us to note, especially at the points where it departs from what we think of as more traditional charity and reshapes the idea of who donors are and what they want. These differences are relevant for those of us in the cultural sector, as we have to develop new pipelines that reflect those shifting donor priorities. So what makes things like mutual aid more unique? I think there's 3 key traits that can inform our strategies. The first is that they're community-centered. Mutual aid is often by communities for communities. I'm thinking a bit about initiatives that sprung up WhatsApp groups for people on the same street and building solidarity in local community. And this means that the people directly affected by an issue are playing a role in consulting and decision-making with their needs at the core of the project. Mutual aid is also democratic. Support at any level is encouraged, and there are other ways to contribute and connect with a cause beyond just the financial. And finally, it's transparent. Mutual aid projects are often really able to articulate how much money they've raised, how and where those donations are going. They are good at narrativizing their impact because they're specifically targeting clear outcomes. I think these principles have been a really powerful motivator for a new generation of younger donors, such as those in the ALBA survey. And as we think beyond our more traditional ways of individual fundraising, there's key insights here for us to consider alongside new audiences. And these considerations will be vital, as individual donations will have to grow considerably to meet mounting financial need. The positive point here is that they are growing. The 2017 to 2019 private investment in culture data reports it as the fastest growing area at 11%. However, this increase alone will not be enough to bridge the gap of statutory decline mentioned above, and it won't address the huge hole left in capital and revenue fundraising with the loss of so much trust income. And finally, corporates. The impact of the crisis was felt very quickly when it came to corporate support. There has been some immediate cancellation of arts partnerships, especially those predominantly structured around events and entertaining. Others have also paused their support indefinitely while assessing the changing economic landscape and remote working. In light of this pause, the conversations with corporates has, for many, moved away from asks towards a relationship-focused dialogue. While corporate supporters' priorities are clearly in a state of flux, it's going to be important to continue stewarding sponsors and cultivating prospects, and to maintain really strong channels of communication around their changing needs. As regional organisations will attest, accessing corporate support outside London has already been an uphill task for many years. The Creative Industries Federation, amongst others, have long been calling for DCMS to incentivise greater regionally based philanthropy for corporates, including through tax incentives where appropriate. I think initiatives such as these will be needed now more than ever. Without them, those regional inequalities are only going to be further compounded. And with that, I think I'm going to hand back to Caroline now.
Thank you, Tash. And whilst I'm conscious that a very uncertain future that we all face. I do really appreciate the very clear picture that the three of you have painted. I think it's extremely helpful to see where we are in summary and to reflect on what we've learned at this moment. I want to pick up on one of the points, which I know you all know is really close to my heart, which is about the democratization of philanthropy. You know that we set up the Achates Philanthropy Prize to promote the very idea of democratization of philanthropy 5 years ago now, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit at the end of the session. We picked up a couple of times on the idea that younger people and families are the most willing to give right now. I found that completely fascinating. Does that tell us that the moment is finally right to grasp this nettle of democratization of giving? Kerryn, I don't know if you want to go first on that.
Yeah, I would actually. I think as the only one of us at the moment who is a parent, I think there is a particular, this is a particular moment, has been a real moment for families, and particularly families with young children at home. I think, so I mentioned earlier, so my family, we did engage with some of the content the Little Angel put out, for example. And that type of content was really appreciated. And I think it makes you more willing to give as a family, because you value it and you see actually how much you get as a family, and actually how much your family experiences are often built around those kind of cultural experiences, visits. I can't remember which one it was, but going back to one of our streams a couple of months ago now, someone was talking about the culture being the opportunity to build memories. And I think that's a really important point. And I think that's something that we're not explicit enough about. And I think if we can start to really articulate what that means for people, that I think could be a real moment where we could start to galvanise that giving from the different groups. And I think, interestingly, it's that knowledge and understanding that we see, which is why I think we're seeing that shift in those giving patterns to the younger people and families. That's my opinion.
Great. Tash, do you want to add to that? And then Kane, I'll come to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as I touched upon, I think that the huge move towards online giving and sort of other initiatives that have been happening has a massive influence on this, because I've noticed you can really feel sort of philanthropy as a muscle that you're exercising, and that I'm seeing calls to donate, crowdfunders, initiatives shared on my social media, on my Instagram stories, and I really feel like it's something that's been folded into my everyday life now, just through a sort of increased exposure to it, because there are so many worthwhile, brilliant causes at the moment, and that it's kind of creating a habit that feels really positive, and that I think certainly I've just noticed that's come through a lot of channels that previously it didn't, as somebody that's on social media way too much. So I think that that might be what's leading to a spike for young people as well.
I love the idea of philanthropy being a muscle we have to flex. Kane, do you want to add into that one?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I mean, I think what this period has enabled is a possibility for organisations to talk about the sort of more invisible sides of what they're doing. So many organisations and venues do really incredible work with hard to reach and disadvantaged groups that is rarely talked about because of the demands of presenting an online programme. And I think, therefore, you end up with fundraising schemes that are more focused on that, on the sort of the return of discounts on tickets and priority booking. And without that, it has forced organisations to think a little bit more about how they talk about themselves. I know, for example, that talking to visual arts organisations recently, they really talk about the sort of invisible 70% of their work. And so I think there is an opportunity to reframe the conversations that you have with audiences, that it doesn't need to be entirely marketing focused, and that you can have grown-up conversations with all of your audiences, not just with a small portion of them, about philanthropy and giving. And I also think it's really, really interesting around this question of income models behind online programming. You know, I know personally for myself that it's really fascinating to see how people are testing paid models, but I think there is a real opportunity to integrate really, really strong messaging around the impact of support into that, and actually, you know, I would probably lean towards a donate model behind online content.
I think it's really interesting question, isn't it? I mean, Kane, it's so good to hear you making this point about the case for support and the invisible work. We certainly at Achates have done a lot of work with organisations in the last couple of months and thinking about how they unify those different offers and how the offers for people who are financially engaging and those who aren't are actually brought together in their brand and communicated in equal terms, absolutely, and unified and not siloed. And I think that point that you make, Kane, about the difference between the fact that cultural organisations have traditionally been very strong on marketing, so we've been very good at ticket sales and commercial engagement, and actually the need to move more to a comms model and understanding the messaging, the purpose of the brand to help people understand and engage philanthropically is actually a point I don't think has quite been made in these sessions before, and I think it's really, really critical. So thank you for that. I just want to read out a little point that's come in on the chat from Adam Rowe at Tetley, who's been a guest with us before. Well, I'm sure we all know this for a long time, the need for it to have a really clear strategy and case for support has really come to the fore, and funding windows have been so short. And I think that's a great point. I think how many organisations we know who applied for something like the Hans and Julia Rousing Emergency Fund and how quickly that was turned around. And it will be really interesting to see the results of that being announced in the coming weeks. A couple more questions for the panelists before I open the floor. Really just want to ask about, I suppose, your view on whether the time for an MPO redistribution has come in the next round. So as we know, MPO has been delayed by a year, but we're working towards that cycle now. Obviously, organisations are going to be facing all sorts of challenges. What are your views on that? Kane, I'm going to be mean and go back to you first.
I think there is a need to redistribute along. I mean, I think that's along a load of different tangents. I think that's geographical, but it's also around how you are particularly working with groups with protected characteristics. I think there is a need. I mean, I think whilst there has been an emphasis and a push, as we spoke about at the Achates live session on diversity, around diversifying the workforce from Arts Council, I think I'm also interested more broadly about how that filters down to, you know, the wider statutory and trust landscape, and particularly to non-national portfolio organisations. I think there's a need to demand more from cultural sector organisations in terms of having a clear purpose and having a clear case for support. And this is something that Adam from the Tetleys talked about in the chat about, you know, the need for a really clear case for support when it comes to funding. And I think there is a need to find a balance within that portfolio of organisations that are, you know, pushing the instrumental value of the arts, the social impact that they're demonstrating, alongside the intrinsic value of the arts, you know, really pushing forward the art form, promoting diverse young talent.
Great, thank you, Kane. And perhaps I can now pass over to Tash. Do you want to comment on that?
Yes, I would follow up with what Kane said, that I think there is a need for that redistribution. And I think the geographic need for that redistribution is going to become even more acute because of all of the widening discrepancies that we've talked about. And I also just think that the way that we exist in our communities, the way we exist socially has changed in quite a fundamental way, and what it means to come together. And so I think the role of organizations to be sort of, if not placemaking, then at the heart of their communities is going to be important now in places where that's really needed. So I think that redistribution has been urgently needed for a little while.
And I think it's really interesting, Tash, isn't it, that the governmental agenda, which is levelling up, which we know the Arts Council are keen to see in all applications to them at the present time as a result, actually does chime quite well with this new strategy. So yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that many of those forces are coming into alignment. Kerry-Ann, anything you want to add in on that point before we go to questions from the floor?
No, I think the only things I have to say is that I absolutely agree with what's been said already. I think often as a team, we do tend to be in agreement, which is always nice. I think particularly with these big questions, I think It's a really interesting thing. I think if we're looking at kind of redistribution of funds, we all know that there needs to be an ecosystem, and it's not about going, you know, some organisations should have nothing, but I think we're all really aware that there are some regions, some areas, some demographic groups that have been much harder hit than others, and that perhaps there are some opportunities to develop those groups, those regions that could be taken at this moment when there is a bit of a shift in the cultural and funding ecosystem.
Great, thank you. There's a lovely point in the chat being made by Liz Hughes, which is really about saying that philanthropy is such a good action, that muscle that we talked about flexing, because it is a way of having influence at a time when so many of us are feeling powerless. But I've got a question for you all from the floor, and it's a question from, is it from Michaela at Cardboard Citizens, Kane, who I have the pleasure of working with along with Tash, and it's a question really about whether there's going to be a greater focus on core funding, unrestricted funding as a result of the experience of COVID. Tash, I'm going to go to you first on that one.
Yeah, I think so. I think what we'll see certainly from trusts is they are already moving their focus there. They've already given, so many have given existing grantees the ability to turn funding unrestricted, to make their funding unrestricted. And I imagine in dialogue with those grantees that will continue, because something we've heard loud and clear from trusts is that they do want to work with people to provide them with what they need. And I think that they can potentially offer them stability longer term through doing that. And they are already sort of doing it. So yeah, I imagine certainly from trusts that we'll see a move towards that, and a redistribution of capital funds in order to make that possible.
Fantastic. Kerry, and anything you want to add on that? It's really interesting.
I did actually just note something down. I think it just goes back to what was being said earlier, and particularly the point that Adam made earlier this afternoon about if we are expecting this shift to come, it does even more, for me, hammer home the idea that we have to make sure that an organisation's case for support is really clear, that your intrinsic instrumental value is there, it's well articulated. Because if we are looking at this shift towards more core support, the giving is going to be even more so than it is now based on your case for support and the articulation of that. So yeah, I think it just really backs up what's been said already this afternoon.
Yeah, Kane, I know you've got an interesting point you want to make about this as well. Could you tell us a bit about that?
I think there's two sides. I mean, firstly, I think that though there may be some positives in terms of funding moving to more unrestricted, models, and again, picked up in the chat, I think there is an issue that we've seen the emergence of these incredibly fast emergency funding rounds that create barriers to access for so many organizations. And I hopefully that trend won't continue, and that what we may see is what the London Community Response Fund has done, where you are able to potentially apply to multiple funders through one application. I think that is really, really interesting. I think at the same time there is an issue around the adoptions of loans as part of the emergency grants portfolio. That what it is going to do is just push a lot of organizations to think very commercially about how they recover, rather than thinking about how they can support their communities.
Yeah, I think it's something that you all know I'm really nervous about. As I said at the beginning, these are the apex predators of our sector. We need them to thrive, that everybody underneath them to thrive. And I'm really worried about the impact of the loans on them and how much artistic risks they're going to be able to take. I think it's a really key point. Now, it actually pertains to a point that's going on in the chat, which is really interesting, which is you've got Sanpreet saying, I think we really need to, as a sector, get better at presenting individual stories of how the arts has impacted people personally and not just an impact on disadvantaged. Then I think you've got Liz Hughes saying, we need to keep people in greater need more than ever on the focus of our work. For me, it could sound like those 2 points are in disagreement, but I think that's really about your individual organisation knowing its purpose, understanding the audiences you're targeting, and having a mix of people who are engaging economically and the people who are not contributing economically, and making sure they sit in harmony. And I think that's really key, and making sure that it isn't the people with money doing things to people who don't have money to engage. And I think that's, again, the kind of dichotomous argument that we've got into the cultural sector over the last few years, it seems to me unnecessary, because the great thing is we bring value to all those communities, and that's really great. So I think that gives me the perfect segue in some ways to move to talk a little bit about this year's Achates Philanthropy Prize. As some of you will know, this is the 5th year of the Achates Philanthropy Prize, and it's a prize that was actually set up by Achates Limited 5 years ago, but now sits in our sister independent organisation, the Achates Philanthropy Foundation. And it really is a way of telling stories of people, individuals and corporates who've supported culture for the first time and celebrating them, mainly because we thought that, well, if I told everybody that they should give to culture, that probably wouldn't be as effective as telling the brilliant stories of the impact on the lives of people who do. We've been really proud of the work of the prize over the last 5 years and really grateful to our partners Bob and Spectrix who supported us in it as well. This year, we're really fortunate in that we have a new partner with us, which is the Paul Hamlin Foundation, who really helped us pivot our offer and respond to the need of the sector at this time. So rather than asking hard-pressed arts organisations to write nominations, we've recruited a fantastic group of prize ambassadors, 8 of which who were selected to research on a paid basis nominations for this year's prize. So we've had ambassadors in the 5 ACE regions in England, 1 in Scotland, 1 in Northern Ireland and Wales, and last night they submitted their 15 nominations each. So we now have 120 nominations. There is no financial award this year. We decided not only were we financially restricted, but equally a prize didn't seem entirely appropriate this year. But what we hope that we're really going to generate is a national showcase of the many ways in which culture brings value to the wider cultural landscape and the landscape of the country as a whole. So those 120 nominations are about to be whittled down to a regional showcase of 24, and those 24 examples will then be judged by our fantastic panel of judges, and 8 will go on to be presented at the virtual ceremony on the 12th of November. And in advance of that 12th of November showcase, what we'll also do is have a one-day conference on the subject of art, audiences, money. You may notice a structural resemblance to the session we've done today, and really just thinking about the big questions that face the sector at the time. That's going to be a free conference. Everyone can participate, and we'll be announcing the speakers in the coming weeks. But yeah, I hope that everybody will look on this regional showcase with pride and the national showcase that ultimately comes from it, because whilst we haven't possibly got the resources to explore every single arts organisation's work, what we hope is that our ambassadors have just found some great stories to shout about that we can all be proud of in terms of what we've achieved in this time. So on that note, we have to introduce our next session, and then I have one more very important task to do. Kerry-Ann, could you just tell us about our session next month, please?
Yes, absolutely. So to clarify, we are moving back to monthly live streams. Obviously, prior to our summer break, we were doing them fortnightly, but we're going back to the old model that we started when we were working with the old Vic. So the next session will be on Tuesday, the 13th of October, and it is entitled Evolving Strategies Culture 2.0, and it is going to be looking at how organisations can evolve their strategies to succeed and survive in this altered universe.
So having laid that altered universe out for you very clearly today, we're really going to look at that session and giving you some tools and strategies to really help evolve the plan for the next phase. So on that point, I want to thank my 3 fantastic panellists today. I want to thank Kane Moore, our Director of Development, Natasha Bloor, our Head of Trusts, who has joined us for the first time today. Brilliant to have you with us, Tash. I also want to say a little au revoir to the fantastic Kerry-Ann Isles, our Executive Director, who has been a brilliant host of the 11 Achates Lives we did since lockdown began, and is going to be greatly missed for the next 6 months, because we're very happy to say that she's going off on adoption leave, and really thrilled and proud for her. And we're really looking forward to welcoming you back in April already, Kerry-Ann, but we're going to miss you in between.
Wish the time away. That's 6 whole months. We already lost 6 months this year. We can't afford to lose another one. Thank you very much, Caroline. And just to say thank you to everyone. It's been a real pleasure doing these sessions, engaging with all the guests, the panelists, and also everyone over on the YouTube chat. Just thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Right, and we're really looking forward to welcoming you back then, Kerry-Ann. In the meantime, thanks so much to everybody. Good to spend the afternoon with you, and enjoy the sunshine while you can. Thanks so much.